Today I would like to record another video which will cover more of the Caro Kann defense, which has been the subject of my last few videos. So previously we worked on some sidelines and then into the sort of another somewhat more accepted way, the fantasy variation. Then we moved into slightly more accepted, the Panov, and we're getting more and more toward the main lines. So today I'd like to digress and go into the old main line, which is not seen a ton these days, but it's still relatively common. And it can be dangerous if you don't know what to do. So that's when after e4, c6, d4, d5, white plays the move knight to c3, which is very kind of straightforward. White's hoping to put pressure on the black center and develop his knight. Now black, in a weird way, doesn't really have a very productive move to make here. Development-wise, if he plays knight f6 after e5, he's really going to suffer. For example, knight d7, f4, and I think the absolute best black can hope for here is a French down at tempo. But, yeah, you don't want any piece of that. So the main move here is d takes e4, with the idea that in this move, we're kind of tearing apart the white center a little bit, and we're probably going to gain some time. So knight takes e4. And there's a few tries here. I've seen some pretty radical stuff. I know even knight f6 is, in theory, a move. The idea of, and after takes, black can recapture either way. But I don't really trust this. It looks a little superficial. Knight d7 is feasible as well. And I've actually looked into this somewhat, and I haven't really found anything convincing for white. But it's a little more dangerous. It's not, and I don't think it's quite as dynamic if black is hoping to play for a win. In any case, I don't think it's a bad move at all, and you can certainly look into it, but I'd rather keep the subject of this video on the move bishop to f5, which I believe is the most principled. So black develops a new piece with this move, and he's putting pressure on the center. So white is almost always playing knight g3 here. There have been some kind of silly games where knight c5 was played or something, but I just don't believe in this at all. Black has a pleasant choice between just b6, kicking the knight, and I mean, he's made some slight weakness in the pawn on c6, but realistically, after playing knight f6, like, let's say, play a few moves, knight f6, bishop e2, bishop e7, castle, I don't know, c4, knight d7. I think black will very likely play c5 and get rid of this weakness, and I don't think it's any serious problem. White's sometimes playing knight d3, and it's not really an issue. If you're looking for something more combative, you can also play e5, which I think is a little bit more feisty, and after takes, I think we're playing queen b6 here, and take, and okay, I mean, black's structure is a little bit dubious, and white has the bishop pair, but all white's pieces are on the back rank, and I think black certainly has adequate compensation for his sort of long-term strategic deficits. In any case, that's not a critical move. Somewhat more common, I would say, is the move bishop d3, but, I mean, you have to have guts, but realistically, after queen takes d4, I don't believe white has enough compensation for the pawn. Let's say knight f3, queen d8. If black is allowed to capture on e4, let's say like white castles, takes, and exchange the queens, then there's no way white will ever have enough compensation. So white's going to have to avoid a queen exchange. And here I think the simplest is probably to just capture the knight and then play knight to f6, because black's gaining some time. He's getting out of any tactics involving discoveries on the bishop on f5. If that bishop on e4 is captured, then white really has no compensation. And let's say, I don't know, bishop d3, e6, black plays bishop e7 and castles. I don't believe white has any serious compensation for the pawn. So that's not really an issue either. So we'll get to the main move, which is knight g3. So white is responding by making a move with a gain of time. And now black plays bishop g6. And we sort of see that this is actually quite similar to a Slav structure, where black will have c6 and e6, and he's got solid pieces. But often what you don't see in the Slav is that this bishop on g6 is outside the pawn chain. This is one of the main strengths of the Caro Kann, is that we solve the problem of the light-squared bishop, which you'll often see in like the semi-Slav or the Nimzo or the French, or a lot of openings against a lot of black openings, essentially. The main drawback of this is it takes time. And we'll see that white is able to try to mess with you right away. If white just plays nonchalantly with a move like knight f3, knight d7, bishop d3, e6, I don't believe black has any problems at all here. He'll play knight f6, and his best development scheme will be bishop e7, castle, queen c7, rook fd8, c5, just like put this on the board. Here, b3, castle, bishop b2, Queen c7. I don't know. Let's say white decides to take finally. Queen e2, rook f d8, rook d1. I don't think black has any serious problems here. He can't quite, or maybe he can play c5 here because after d5 actually we can capture, and then queen e7 would fail to rook e8. But it's also not necessary. Black can play other moves. I kind of like the idea of playing a5, a4 to try to open lines on the queen side. Black's extremely solid, and I don't think he has anything to worry about. Yeah, white has a little more space, but black doesn't have any bad pieces, and he has chances to make his own active play. In any case, this is also not critical. The main move is to play the h4 here. And with this move, white is trying to chase that bishop away. So if black were to play a silly move, obviously knight d7, then after h5, black would really be suffering after, probably bishop f5 with queen f5, a5 check is the only way to avoid immediately losing, but it's already just bad news. We don't want any piece of this. So I'd recommend the move h6, which keeps your kingside structure intact and gives your bishop a flight score on h7. Knight f3 from white. This should entice black to play knight d7 because if he plays like e6 for example, I think after knight e5, bishop h7, and now a strong move queen h5, white is significantly better. Black has a hard time defending his weakness on f7, and if he plays g6 after just queen f3, we've kind of buried the bishop on h7. Anyhow, that's not to be recommended. I think knight d7, holding that e5 square under control is a good idea. h5 now, bishop h7, and white plays bishop d3, takes. So let's stop here for a second. We've sort of got the battle lines drawn. White has more space and is slightly in development, but black has a very solid position, and in the long run, the pawn on h5 could become a target in a lot of endgames. Black's development scheme is pretty obvious, but I think it's a little bit important which way he does it. I would recommend playing e6 first. Basically, e6, knight f6, bishop e7 is probably the development scheme you want to follow, but it's a little bit awkward to play knight f6 first because now white can play bishop f4. And I think it's a little bit less flexible for black. After e6, if white plays bishop f4, which is the old main move, I think black has a strong move, queen f5 check. And the point is now, if white plays some move like c3, after knight f6, white's not going to be able to castle queenside, which was his main strategic idea. Obviously, after throwing h4, h5 out down. So I don't think this is what white wants. White wants to get rid of that queen who's attacking the a2 pawn. But now after bishop d2, we see the point of having played e6, which is that black can play bishop b4, which he couldn't do previously. And now there's kind of some goofy line with knight e4, but just a calm, collected response. Knight f6 should solve all problems. Knight d6, king e7, takes, bishop d2, and there's knight d2, and now queen b4, and after something like queen b3 takes, castles. At first it looks dangerous, but I don't believe it. Just rook b8, and black looks totally fine to me. I don't see any serious discoveries for white, and black pieces are all in good squares. Black can run the king back to f8 and g8 when necessary. I see no problems at all for black. And also, queen takes d2, queen b5 is similarly good for black. In fact, I think here black's much better because after knight a5, knight e4, suddenly white actually loses a piece. So, this is not something to worry about. Much more critical is for white to play c3. But now we drop back to e7, of course, not f8. e7's gaining time. And again, white can't castle along. So c4, queen c7, and now he'll castle along. But I don't believe these positions are problematic for black at all because white has already played the move c4. And having already played the move c4 when white castles long, before black castles long, is often a bad thing. For example, let's say knight f6, knight e4, and okay, there's a million moves you can play here. When I first reached this position, I played rook d8, which I think is totally fine. g3, knight e4, queen e4, knight f6, queen e2. And now we see a very typical motif for when this happens. Black plays b5, which will open some lines on the queen side and give him permanent control of the d5 square. And I think black is absolutely fine. He might even start to get a more pleasant position pretty soon. The only time I had this position was against Steven Zurich. I think I covered this game in a previous chess.com video a year and a half ago. Anyhow, that game was not very pleasant for white. So basically, by playing bishop f4 and queen a5, we're provoking the pawn to c4. And by doing that, we can sort of break down the safety of the castle's queenside setup. So what's much more common these days is for white to play bishop d2, knight f6, castles, bishop e7. And here white has a bunch of options. But before we get into that, I should say what I believe about this position. I believe that if black castles queenside, he's slightly worse for a very long time. Now, I don't think this is necessarily a reason not to play it. You're very solid. That's not really a concern. Like, for example, let's say king b1, queen c7, knight e4, castles long. I mean, black is very solid here. It's hard to do much, but at the same time, he's kind of passive. He has a hard time making progress or coming up with an active plan, especially considering c5 is his normal plan, but here it'll open up his king a bit. I think that it's a little bit unpleasant. Now, for white to truly apply pressure at a level at which to make black feel discomfort, I think white would have to be a very, very strong player. You know, I saw Karpov defend these positions a lot. It's not like they're that terrible. And even still, it's not like super common, but I've definitely seen it, like especially in a case where we've got, you know, like a 2650 playing black against a 2600 and the 2650 wants to make a draw. In any case, I think it's somewhat underrated, but for the purposes of our videos, I'm going to want us to castle kingside. So castle and kingside is going to be much more combative because black will be able to open the center really quickly with a move like c5 to try to get his pieces on nice squares. And it's a much more like theoretically, or not quite theoretically, but sort of like, it's a much more principled continuation. But the drawback is that white has attacking chances by trying to play g4, g5 and attack the king side. So yeah, we'll get into that in just a sec. Bishop e7 is, I think, the best move, but there's a lot of room for creativity in these positions. I know Ivan Chuk played, I think, the most crazy move I could possibly. He just played a5 in this position against Dominguez one game, and I was like, or maybe no, sorry, not Dominguez, the other Cuban champion, Bruzon, and I was like, what are you doing? How can you possibly play chess like this? But well, Ivan Chuk won in like 8 more moves or something. So I don't know. It was kind of there's some interesting stuff, but I'd prefer a more principled approach, just bishop e7. So white has a few options here. If he plays the move knight to e4, this is, I think, one of the few times I'm not going to recommend like castling quickly. Here I'd say capture the knight, and now knight f6. So you've traded off your redundant knights, and you're hoping to bring your queen into d5. So white has 2 options. If he plays queen e2, you just play queen d5, and you're probably going to get some endgame queen e4, takes. And I think black has no reason to complain here. It looks more or less completely equal to me. But not even a draw kind of equal. You can still play for an advantage. I mean, there's some interesting try. Like f5 is very dynamic and aggressive. It weakens a lot of squares, but at the same time it's threatening f4, and like if white plays g3, we play bishop g5, threatening f2. And if we ever take, there's h takes and the h pawn is hanging. I think black has enough dynamic play to compensate for the pawn weakness, the weak squares he's just made, but yeah, you also can play a much more solid and reserved game. Castles, rook d8, rook c8, play for c5. I mean, the position's equal, but black can continue the game, as can white. A little more challenging is queen d3. Here, queen d5 does not work, because after c4, queen e4, queen b3, I think black is going to suffer. Basically, the queen on e4, white's about to play rook e1 and kick that queen into oblivion. Meanwhile, the queen side is coming under serious fire, so allowing queen b3 is not what we have in mind. But here, I think black can just castle. I was a little bit more skeptical of this when white had the queen on e2, because I thought he could get attacking chances. But here, I don't think there's any problem. Like, for example, if white plays like rook g1 to try to organize an attack, I think black can play queen d5 now, and after c4, queen takes h5. I don't believe that white has any huge attacking potential. I mean, he has some, but it's nothing to be too concerned about. So the real sort of critical try is to just play g4, burn the bridges, open the file at any cost. But here I think just knight takes g4. And now we sort of see one of the drawbacks is that white could have had the queen on e2, but if that's the case, we wouldn't have gone for this. But here the queen would really be much better placed on e2. Let's say white plays rook g1. There's some insanity after knight f2, queen e2, knight d1, bishop h6. I'm not entirely sure what's going on, and I don't really care enough to find out. It looks way too risky to me. Here's simple f5. Looks very logical, shutting down the open f file. The open g file, excuse me. So white will probably play the move queen e2 here. If white were to make... The real problem is white wants to get rid of this knight on g4, but he has a hard time doing it. So queen e2 is a logical move, defending f2, attacking e6, and hoping for knight e5. But here, I actually recommend just giving back the e6 pawn by playing king h8, because I think knight e5 is a more important threat. If knight e5 now just takes, and I don't think black has any huge problems. I mean, he's got the weakness on g7, but realistically, rook f7, bishop f8, I doubt he can have any serious problems of getting mated. So, much more common would be queen takes e6, but here I think strong move queen d6. If the queen's exchange, black's absolutely fine. And let's say white retreats the queen. Black plays bishop f6. I mean, black gave the pawn back, but his pieces are all perfectly active. He'll play rook e8 very quickly. I see no reason for black to complain. His king also looks totally safe. So that's if knight e4. King b1 is also a move. And now after castles, they're playing queen e2. And this, we have to sort of be a little bit careful. I actually reached this position once, and I pretty quickly played c5, just looking for my typical center counterplay, and after dc, queen c7, knight f5, bishop c5. I had this position against John Bryant, which I also covered in a video here, which I'd recommend looking at that if you want to see this. But white missed a resource, we both did actually, is that white actually has to move d5, which looks completely ludicrous, but actually it's very strong. The point is, if knight takes d5, white simply plays knight e4, and suddenly the white knight on g3 found a really good square, which means the g-pawn can start moving very quickly, and black does not have the mechanism of I'll exchange knights with my other knight in f6, get the queen out to defend, and here the g4, g5 thrust is very, very dangerous. And e takes d5 ironically loses immediately to bishop takes h6, gh6, knight f5, rook e8 takes, and now king f8, strong move queen d2, and the white queen will be showing up on g5. The problem is knight e4 will run into queen takes d5, and we have a fork. White will at least win a piece back, probably more. And, I don't know, some other move like queen b6, just queen g5. Now the knight on f6 can't move because I'm mate on g8, and white's next move is knight f5, and I think black's losing. So this would not be good for black. You don't want any piece of that. So the best move here is queen b6, which is a solid move, just attacking the d4 pawn and preparing to play d5. So white would like to move this knight on g3 out of the way so we can run the g-pawn, but it's not that easy. If white plays knight e4, I don't think this should be a problem. Probably c5 is the easiest, and it looks like black's opening line's at least as fast as white. Knight f1 is also played, and now c5, g4, takes, g5, takes, and white did open the g-file, but realistically I think black has more attacking chances than white in this position. He's got an extra pawn, knight c3 is on the way, rook c8's coming, queen a5, knight b4. There's a lot of ways for black to organize an attack here, and I think, especially considering that a queen trade will favor him, I think that black is very comfortable despite the g-file having been opened. So yeah, I think queen b6 is the best move there. Sort of the most critical move, I believe, is queen e2. With this move, white is playing sort of prophylactically. He's anticipating black castling. And now after castles, strong move knight f1, I do think black is in trouble. g4, g5 comes very fast. For example, c5, g4, takes, g5, takes. And the difference of queen b6, king b1 not being thrown in is huge, because white will be able to play rook takes d4, and he won't have to worry about any knight c3 check. I think that black is really going to suffer here. I've seen a lot of really nice attacking games from this position. So I think we have to find a better solution. There's a few possibilities. There's c5 is the most principled, but there's also sort of tamer options, and I like queen c7, to be honest. And I think now white's playing rook e1, castle, and knight f5, but I think just taking this is quite fine for black. Black will play takes and like rook e8, put the knight on e4, and he'll be quite happy. Other options, I'm trying to remember exactly what white's doing here. I think there's some knight e5 has been tried, and then like castles, knight g6, but here just rook e8, take, and I think black is quite fine as well. So this is not a problem. I think queen c7 is a good move. Another move white could try here is knight f1 to like really say, okay, well, you're still not castling next move. But here, I believe black can castle queenside. And now, normally I don't recommend this, but if white's going to play a move as ridiculous as knight f1, which is just so horrible against the castle's long strategy, I think black can just sort of call his bluff, so to speak. And I think black's quite fine here. In any case, I'll briefly mention the sort of main line after queen e2, c5, which does have some insanity to it. It's rook e1, castles, knight f5. Okay, personally, I think e takes f5 is a decent move here that's quite underrated. But the main moves are c takes d4. Rook e8 is possible. I played this once against Ray Robson, actually, but and I held a draw pretty easily. But I think that after rook e8, white has some chances for an edge. Probably cd is the most critical. Knight d4, bishop c5, knight h6, take, and like rook e8. And I think they're playing g4 now. And the position's very complicated. Nobody really has any idea what's going on. My computer always changes its mind very quickly back and forth. This position's been played a few times with good results for both sides.